Okay, Build Stuff, welcome back. You made it. Friday afternoon, the final stretch. So we got a couple more great sessions lined up for you this afternoon. We're going to be closing out this afternoon. We got Scott Hanselman joining us to talk about coding with Linux on top of Windows, which is a fantastic technology. He's a really great person to talk about it. But first, it is my, before that, we got me. I got to introduce myself on this stage and tell you how to do 3D graphics in JavaScript. But before that, please welcome somebody who's been working in software for about 16 years now. Doing stuff from building analysis systems for casinos to that thing every developer does at some point where they write bank software for a couple of years to pay the bills. But he's also somebody who spent a lot of time working and researching and thinking about mental health and psychology and the way that it affects motivation, burnout, all these kinds of things that can affect so many of us working in the tech industry. So please give a big warm welcome, Arthur Doler.
Thanks, everybody. Let's see. At some point, the slides might show up. There we go. Like you said, my name's Arthur Doler. I work at a company named Aperture in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I live in the United States. And I'm a crazy person. I use that word very specifically because it highlights how bad we are at language and how awful it is to try and talk about publicly what happens inside of our heads and inside of other heads. On top of that, we think we are separate from our emotions. We think we're in total control of our own thoughts. And I'm here to tell you that we're not. So today, we're going to talk about how your experiences affect you, especially at work. And then we're going to talk about me for about 15 minutes in the middle of the presentation, because it's my presentation and you can't stop me. Then we're going to talk about why you should be talking about your mental health and your mental state at work. And then we're going to talk about how to talk about it. And lastly, we're going to talk about overcoming roadblocks to talking about it. So before we jump in, have to say, the situations here are hypothetical. Their advice is representative. Every situation is different. Please don't assume this is the correct advice. I am not a psychologist. I am not a therapist. I am not a licensed anything. So, with that, let's talk about the world, your brain, and you. I don't think it's a stretch to say that we largely can't control what happens to us, right? I mean, the last several years have been a perfect example of that causality is extremely complex, and the world is largely out of our own control. But I don't think it's also a stretch to say that what happens to us affects us. I gave a talk yesterday about burnout and how badly that's increased since the pandemic started. Things that happen in the world that happen to you affect you. Now that seems obvious, right? But in general, we also can't control our own thoughts. We want to believe that we can, but mostly the big wet sack of meat between your ears just kind of does its own thing. There's a study that I like to cite, and they talk about thought control failure. And we're so bad at thought control failure that this is the title of the study. It's not even, can we control our thoughts? It's measuring thought control failure, sensory mechanisms, and individual differences. The key quote from this study is, we found that the average thought control index score was not significantly above 0. I mean, this is the old trope, right? I can get you to think about a purple elephant by saying, don't think about a purple elephant. And it leaps into your head. You largely can't control what's going on up there. But we tend to believe in what we think without examining it, to just chase forward with it. There are whole schools of therapy or existence like mindfulness or CBT that are based around the concept of maybe taking a step and looking at what's going on. Additionally, how you feel affects how you think. Donald Norman, who's one of my favorite psychologists, has done a ton of stuff into user-centered research and human-centered research, has also written about how your emotions affect your ability to process the world around you. And he kind of talks about how there's two running processes in your brain, the cognitive process and the affective process. And the cognitive process works about like you think the brain works. It's logical, it's linear, it's rational. This is kind of how you expect thinking to work. But the affective process has a job, and that job is basically to sort the world into two buckets, good and bad. And it's running all the time. The interesting part about these two processes is that they play into each other. If I put what they call a negative affect on you, if I make you feel bad, if I make you feel anxious or upset or nervous or fearful, you actually think less well. This is exactly what's happening on sites like Kayak, where they're showing you a countdown to how long this price is going to last. Or when you go into a web store and add something to your cart and they're like, there's only 3 left at this price. They're trying to make you feel anxious and upset so that you're dumber and you buy their thing. The opposite is also true. If you have a good feeling, if I make you feel like you are awesome and that you are competent and cool, which, by the way, all of you are, then you're better at thinking. You're better at actually cognitively processing the world. So, all right, your emotions affect you, but talking about them sounds awful. Okay, it does. So let's do an experiment. I want you to listen to some stories. Let's talk about who is Art. Art was born into a family with a history of undiagnosed mental illness, ADHD, depression, anxiety, and potentially even bipolar II. His initial symptoms manifested as acting out during early childhood, possibly disguised by the non-standard learning environment in which he found himself. He developed a resistance to authority, actively masked by socially normative behavior in public settings or when he was explicitly being examined. His impulsive actions often resulted in significant tensions with his teachers and with his family. Initial attempts at diagnosis were unsuccessful due to a significant non-disclosure and a lack of engagement in the process. His family cohesion suffered as a result, and conflict manifested. He experienced delayed entry into the public school system due to a result of a private school transition. During this time, his inability to control his impulsive behaviors led to a general isolation from his peer group. Failure of his executive functions also led to his inability to satisfactorily complete schoolwork. That peer isolation led to a reaction formation in favor of self-isolation and a prolonged self-narrative that led to depressive episode. He finally sought treatment and was diagnosed with ADD and clinical depression. He began a medication regime that was subject to significant changes and frequent alterations, but which proved to have a beneficial effect on his schoolwork. On the other hand, previous existing behavioral and communication problems within his family persisted, resulting in a continuing deterioration of the situation. As a result, he voluntarily relocated to family members' houses during his senior year of high school. College provided Art with a unique opportunity to redevelop his persona, absent of familiar persons or environs. On the other hand, eventual medication noncompliance led to a resurgence of his ADHD symptoms with a predictable decline in his academic ability. He developed personal coping strategies for ADHD, primarily involving artificially inflating stress by means of artificial deadlines or negative self-talk. He's also did self-medication through significant abuse of caffeine. He achieved moderate success managing his ADHD symptoms until taking a job with high levels of systemic and intrinsic stress, and he began experiencing panic attacks and typical aversive behavior. He re-entered treatment, was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and engaged in a year of therapy before embarking on a course of medication. He also adopted and investigated a mindfulness practice as a secondary course of treatment. He has been 100% medication compliant for almost 9 years. His symptoms are 98% managed with occasional flare-ups, and he's continued to engage in treatment regimes. Okay. That was Art. But who am I? I always knew that I was different from other kids. I could sense it. Like there was something in the air that they could feel, that they could see, that I just couldn't perceive. And I didn't understand why I did things. Why sometimes the things I did would hurt people. It was like a thought leapt into my head and it immediately came out of my hands. And my parents or my teachers would look at me and ask me, Art, why did you do that? And I would look at them and say, I don't know, because I didn't. And their response was not to like that answer. And so I learned not to trust them. And I learned that I was different. I felt so different and so alone that I actually believed at one point that I was an alien, that my parents, my true parents, had crash landed on Earth, and in some weird Superman scenario, my well-meaning but ultimately incapable human parents had adopted me, which wasn't true. But it's what I believed in that time. And my parents, in desperation, tried to put me into therapy and put me in front of a psychologist. And I knew what good boys were supposed to act like, and I could hold it together for the length of a 45-minute session. And so I did. Now, to be fair, if you are a therapist and you let an 8-year-old buffalo you, that's kind of on you. But he turned around and blamed my parents, which I'm sure you can all imagine how well that went. And so things just proceeded to get worse. I went to a Montessori school as a child, which was a fantastic environment for me, but it had a weird problem where it went through only 6th grade. And in Indiana, in the United States where I grew up, we had a thing called middle school, which is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I entered middle school in 7th grade, which is very much like parachuting into no man's land in World War I. Everybody has already made all of their friends and all of their cliques, and I was kind of parachuting into the middle, and I was not prepared for that for multiple reasons. But if you ever do find yourself in that situation, here's a tip. Barking at people in the hallways does not help. Just take that from me. And I turned around and I started telling myself another story like I did when I was a child. My peers didn't understand me. They looked at me and was like, wow, that guy is super weird. And they pulled away from me. And I told myself, well, they're clearly just jealous that I am a misunderstood genius, obviously. And they just jealous. They don't understand me. And by God, if they don't need me, then I don't need them. That's not a way to live. And so eventually everything came to a peak, and I turned around and I went back to my mom and I was like, hey, can we try that therapy thing again? And this time I bought in. This time I turned around and talked with the guy, and I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and with clinical depression. Although frankly, if you can find a child of that age who does not have diagnosable clinical depression, they deserve a medal. And they put me on medication, and like horse doses of Dexedrine, which is a drug they used to give to combat pilots in Vietnam, for Christ's sake, and Luvox, which was an antidepressant at the time. And to be fair, it did work. I started getting better at socializing. I started being able to kind of perceive the world of other humans. But I had already learned how my family dynamics worked. I had already learned how to piss off my parents, and it was more or less habit at that point. And it almost couldn't stop it. So my senior year of high school, my therapist said, you need to get out of there. And I said, you are damn right I do. So I went and lived with my grandmother for a while and then with my uncle. And then I went to college. And college was a wonderful opportunity because I didn't know anybody, and it was great. I could reinvent myself, figure out how to be a person. And then, because we all do stupid things in college, I went off my meds. I didn't drink in college, I just went off my meds. And I had to learn how to deal without them. And that involved a significant amount of yelling at myself, telling myself, why are you so stupid? Why can't you just do things? Which just came back as echoes from my parents in my childhood. Looked at me and would say things like, Art, you're so smart, why do you do such dumb things? Which is the most backhanded compliment I think I've ever heard to this day. But I figured it out, and I turned around and I graduated college. I'm not going to tell you what my GPA was, but I did graduate, and I got a job somehow. And I held it together until I took a job working in a company that provided US election hardware, which I talked a little bit about this in my previous talk. Yes, that job had no stress at all, right? It was an extremely stressful job. And I started finding myself sitting in the car outside of work, not certain that I could actually make myself go in. I started experiencing panic attacks. And I know that isn't right, so I got up and I went and I'm like, okay, let's go back to therapy. So I did, and I got back on medicine. I started meditating. I started learning more about myself. I got pretty deep into psychology and all of this. And I found a road to recovery for me. And I've been walking that road ever since. So what was different between those two stories? I mean, it's not just the pronouns, right? The difference is in the way that the stories are told and the language that the stories use. The first story was told in clinical language, and the second story was told in experiential language. Clinical language is focused on the diagnosis. It's focused on the medicality, and it's deficits-based. It's about what you can't do, what's going wrong. It constrains and it confines, and it is by nature emotionless. On the other hand, experiential language focuses on what's happening to an individual. It focuses and describes and delineates. And it's based on the personal truth of that individual. And it is by its very nature emotional. The difference between clinical language and experiential language is the difference between this conversation and this conversation. There's a world of difference between the two. One of them is going to get you in trouble with HR, and one of them is not. Clinical language is, by its very nature, designed and about passivity. It removes power from the individual. Experiential language is all about self-direction and self-responsibility. Clinical language has an external locus of control. The control in those situations is outside of the person, as opposed to experiential language, where the locus of control is internal to that person. And that can result in self-directed action and self-responsibility. Whereas clinical language can result in learned helplessness and passivity of the person. Now, this is a software conference, so the odds are that you are at least somewhat technical. And so the question comes up, isn't clinical language the correct terminology? Right? We're engineers. We like to be precise. We like to be direct. Like, is this right, the right definition? So let's talk about that for a second. Diagnoses in the United States primarily come from a book called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Behavioral Health, edition 5. It's basically the big book of ways that your brain breaks. And what you might think is, if you look through here, it will read like a syntax description of a language, but it doesn't. What it looks like is stuff like this. These are criteria for the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnosis, which is one of my diagnoses. These are effectively checklists. That's what a diagnosis is. You are going in to a therapist, to a psychiatrist, to even your GP, and they're basically running down a list and going, yep, you got that, you got that, you got that. It's more or less bird watching. Yeah, it has slightly yellow wings and a yellow belly. Yep, that's a yellow belly sapsucker. Great. What is happening is that these diagnoses are basically just buckets. They're collected groups of symptoms that are often bound together. And I don't begrudge the medical community for having these. You need something to wrap your arms around. But when we're discussing how things exist in real life, we pretend that these are way more definitive than they are. And in fact, cultural norms can affect what's even considered to be a diagnosis. In the DSM-4, being gay was a diagnosable mental illness. And on top of that, the diagnosis is often dependent on an assessment of the duration or the intensity of an effect. And those are going to vary depending on doctor. And there's no real test to verify this. I mean, I come from the United States, right? And our medical system, everyone will agree, is basically a giant dumpster fire. You can better believe that if there was a blood test that my insurance could make me take that would prove that I needed the drugs that I need, they would make me take it. And they don't, because that doesn't exist. It's not real. And on top of all of that sits the problem that things like anxiety or depression are part of the normal human experience. At what point do they become clinical? Depends. The thing I want you to take away from this, the thing that I really want to drill into your heads, is that a diagnosis is not prescriptive. It is descriptive. It is describing a person's way in the world. And if you have a diagnosis and somebody else has a diagnosis, you can have very different experiences of living in the world. Just because you know what it's like for one person does not mean you know what it is like for everyone with that same diagnosis. I prefer to think of this as lived experience, the way that you live and exist in the world. Okay, so we talked a little bit about it. Why does talking about it matter so much? This is the big pitch where I try and sell you on why you need to be talking about this more. Well, my primary pitch is that you are the only advocate for your experience. The only person who knows what it is like to be inside of your head is you. And if you are unable to communicate that to other human beings, and if they're unable to listen, then you are dramatically hampered in your ability to succeed because you cannot ask for what you need. Human beings need each other, and we need help. Every one of us needs help and support. And if you can't ask for it, then you can't receive it. If we want to reach the future that you've been hearing about this entire conference, we need to be more open about these things, and we need to have a language to discuss them with each other that isn't rooted in this diagnosis. On top of that, sharing with others creates cohesion. Being vulnerable dramatically actually increases the trust that other people have in you. And cohesion is necessary for success. On top of that, we talked about how your emotions affect you. Do you think that if you're dealing with something, not even a diagnosis, something like your parent going through cancer, do you think that's not affecting your velocity as a team? It is. You're not going to ship the same number of points because you've got an immense amount of other things on your mind. And so planning for it instead of just trying to sweep it under the rug is important. Above and beyond that, you are the only person who can advocate for yourself. There's a thing that humans do, a cognitive bias, where we'll leap to conclusions about other people called the fundamental attribution error. I used to work with a coworker, and he would fall asleep at his desk. And I don't mean like cute, like his head back snoring in his desk chair. This was about the time Diablo 3, the computer game, came out, and all of us other coworkers used to laugh at this guy. And like, of course he's been up late playing Diablo 3. Of course he's just like doing something online till all hours of the morning. You know, none of us ever asked him. None of us ever stopped and said, "Hey, is something wrong? Is there a problem?" We just jumped to a conclusion. And when other people look at your behavior, they're doing the same thing. The story that they have in their heads is, I guarantee you, not as good as the one in yours. So being able to communicate that story and that experience is also important. So what keeps us from talking about it? What holds us back? Well, a couple of things. We have a lack of good language. There's fear, there's shame, and there's something called facile optimism. So let's walk through each of these. And first, let's talk about how to talk about it, the language we use. Now, we're going to need a little help to walk through this, so I would like you to, we want to avoid situations like this with Steve. If anyone's named Steve, I'm sorry. So let's meet Jordan and Taylor, who are going to help us through a number of different scenarios to talk about things. Now, the first rule is you cannot fix or solve anything. This is my favorite out of context slide. Can't solve anything. No, what I mean is if you are having a conversation about your mental health or somebody else's mental health or their experience in the world, you are not there to fix them. You are not there to solve them. And I guarantee you, if you go up to somebody who's having problems with depression and you're like, "Have you just tried smiling more?" They're going to stab you and you're going to deserve it. So you're not here to fix somebody else. You can help, but you're not there to fix them because they don't need fixing. So, conversational type 1A is Jordan asking Taylor for future support. Because a lot of us are engineers, sometimes we're not great at the words, so we have an asking script. Hey, I could use some support. Can you please do this helpful action? Or I don't know if you knew this, but I'm having problems with or I'm dealing with a specific kind of experience. You've been helpful to me in the past. Would it be okay if in the future I ask you to help me when this thing happens? So for instance, Jordan could say, hey, I've been having a tough time with my mood lately. If you see me starting to isolate myself and pull away, can you just take me out for a cup of coffee? Now, ideally, Jordan is going to be clear and direct in what they're asking Taylor to do and when they're asking Taylor to do it. And ideally, Taylor isn't going to problem solve. Remember rule 0. And they're also not going to promise something that they're not comfortable doing. If you commit to giving somebody support at a future point and you don't give it when it's there, when it's time, that's way worse than just saying, no, I can't do that up front. Conversational type 1B is Jordan in a critical moment asking Taylor for support. Okay, hold up. What do we mean by critical moment? There are a lot of terms for what happens when basically the crap hits the fan in the human brain. People call it crisis. I prefer the term critical moment. And I define critical moment as a moment when your normal coping strategies just no longer work. Whatever it is you learn to do to get through the world falls down. I had a critical moment when I took that job. In a critical moment, we have to unfortunately talk about safety. Because these are the moments that are extremely important. In those moments, I want you to not be alarmist, okay? I want you to get the facts and talk to somebody. Don't assume that they're safe, and don't assume that they're not safe. I'm not 100% on what it's like here, but I know in the United States, if you call 911 when somebody's having a moment where they're considering suicide, you have just escalated that situation dramatically, because now people with guns are going to show up. I'm not saying you don't try to help. What I'm saying is you get the facts, you ask them. I guarantee you that if somebody is actually contemplating suicide, you asking them if they're thinking about it is not going to put it in their head. It's already there. If you have a clear and unambiguous statement of intent, they tell you that they have the means and they know when they're going to do it, that's when you call for help. So, not every dramatic moment, not every critical moment is that dire. Jordan could simply be saying, hey, you might not know this, but I deal with some mood issues and I really need some help telling which emotions are real right now. Ideally, in those moments, Jordan's going to ask for whatever they need right now as specifically as they can manage. And if they need to leave, they can explain that they're just going to leave. Ideally, Taylor is going to remain calm. You have a tendency when somebody else comes up to you and they're panicking or they're nervous and anxious, these mirror neurons activate in your head and you're like, oh, yeah, we're anxious and nervous. Dude, try and remain calm. Try and breathe and not, feel the other person's anxiety. And ideally, Taylor isn't going to take Jordan's leaving as an insult. If a person needs to leave, it's probably not about you. Conversational type 2 and 2A is Jordan offering future support to Taylor. Like the asking script, we have an offering script. Hey, I noticed behavioral observation here. Can we talk about it? Or do you think that you could use this action here? Can I help provide that? For instance, Jordan could say, hey, Taylor, I noticed that when someone disagrees with you in a meeting, you stop talking and you just shut down, even though you clearly care a lot about what you're saying. Would you like me to help back you up when that happens? Ideally, Jordan is going to accept a no answer gracefully and doesn't take it personally. Maybe that's just not what that person needs or wants right now. And ideally, they're going to keep their judgments and opinion out of it. Ideally, Taylor is only going to talk about their mental state if they want to. Talk a little bit more about that later. But they're also going to try and provide clear guidance for what Jordan can do. Conversational type 2B is Taylor in a critical moment and Jordan offering support. So as an example, it seems like you're going through a rough moment. If you want, I can cover for you if you need to step out. Support can come in a number of different ways, and it doesn't have to be huge. Something like this can be immense for somebody who's undergoing a panic attack. Ideally, in those moments, Jordan is going to keep their judgments and opinion out of it. And they're going to follow the support guidelines or safety guidelines, unless they've prearranged a support response with Taylor. And ideally, Taylor's going to be honest about what they need, even if it's nothing. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. Your brain is going to go that way, and it's just going to do it what it does. And there's nothing anybody can do. And ideally, also, they're not going to assume that they're being a waste of Jordan's time. Especially in the darkest moments, it's easy for you to assume that you don't deserve somebody else's help, that you're not worth it. And that's not true. Conversational type 3 is Taylor explaining their experience to Jordan. So we again have an explanation script. So when this event happens, I sometimes, often, or always feel like this. To cope or deal with that, I sometimes do this behavior here. So Taylor could say, when I'm in a meeting and somebody asks me a question, my brain freezes and all I can think about is what happens if I screw up and answer incorrectly. To cope with that, I spend time before the meeting obsessing over all the things people could ask me, so I'm not very responsive. Ideally, Jordan is going to listen respectfully. It isn't going to problem solve. Remember, that person is not a problem for you to solve. And ideally, Taylor is going to avoid blaming or ranting because emotions can get high in that moment. But they're also not going to apologize for their feelings. Most importantly, this situation could not be okay with Jordan. And that's okay too. Taylor is offering their explanation for their behavior. That doesn't automatically mean they get a pass. But it provides a beginning point to now have a conversation about what can change, what can help, and anything else that could be adapted. Conversational type 4 is the check-in. We have a check-in script. You all ready for this one? Hey, how you doing? It's just mind-blowingly hard. The thing we task every morning, I come from the Midwest, so sometimes people answer with living the dream, which is always not honest. It's always insincere. But that thing that we do to each other every morning can become a touch point, can become a moment where we ask, how are you feeling today? And they answer honestly. Now, ideally, Jordan is only going to answer with any depth if they feel comfortable answering with depth. And ideally, Taylor is legitimately going to care about how Jordan is doing. If you ask this question and somebody says, well, I'm not sure, I had a bad weekend, my cat's sick or whatever, and then you're like, yeah, it sounds great, bye. Like, that's not meaningful or genuine in any way, and you've probably caused more harm. You can also, or rather Taylor could also set up a recurring check-in appointment with Jordan. Conversational type 5 is Taylor and Jordan talking like normal human beings. Hello, fellow human. It's a good day to enjoy things like oxygen and carbon, is it not? It is, since I'm also clearly human. I enjoy these things also, including making noises through my mouth parts. I'm joking, but what I mean here is, after you start having a conversation with somebody about their mental health, not every conversation needs to be about their mental health. It's not like Monday, it's like, oh yeah, we talked about this. Tuesday, how's the depression going? Like, you can they're still humans. They still have other things they care about. You can ask them about those things. Ideally, though, across all of this, you want to remain compassionate. You want to remain kind. It is very hard to ask for help. It is very hard to offer help in these cases. No matter which side of the equation you're on, remain kind. But what if you don't want to talk about it? What if you really don't want to talk about it with Steve? Well, then you don't talk about it. I'm advocating for you to talk about it, to find safe places to engage with this. But you're the only one who can know if you can trust your coworkers, if you can actually do this in a safe environment. I'm not advocating that you go out there and start putting yourself in situations that might be dangerous, that might actually be harmful to your career. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those situations at the end of the talk. But that's language. So we've got 3 things left that prevent us from talking about this. And it's fear, shame, and facile optimism. So let's talk about fighting each of those in turn. First up is a thing called facile optimism, which is a term that I kind of invented because I couldn't find a good one. And it's a description of this thing we do where we minimize our own experience to keep a control over it, where we turn around and say, oh no, I'm fine, it's great, it's just a leg, I didn't need it, we'll be okay. Like it helps us feel like we're in control, which is a thing we want, right? Our brains want to feel like we're in control, even though largely in our life we are not. And so we minimize our own experience and we don't ask for the help that we need. And facile optimism is what's preventing us. And the way you can get around it is have the conversations before things get dire. You can frame it as like, this is a thing that might happen in the future or a thing that could happen. And that might make it easier for you to have the conversation later. Everybody, even your boss, is going to appreciate a heads up if you can say, this is a situation that might occur to me at some point. You can also turn around and use others. Others might be able to see how it's affecting you better than you can. Fighting fear. Now, I'm asking you to do a hard thing in the moment that it is going to be the hardest, all right? I know that this isn't easy. And I know that especially when your brain starts fighting with you, that's not an easy time to go up to somebody else and tell them what's going on. You can work through some of that by preparing before it actually happens. By turning around and making a checklist and making a plan for what's going to happen. Who are you going to tell if something happens? Decide who and figure out how you're going to tell them. Can you work with them to set up a plan for how they're going to tell them so that they're expecting it? You can even ask, what habits can you form now that will help you if something happens? Things you could do to help manage your stress, things you can do to build a plan that will help you if you ever hit a moment where your other coping strategies don't work. And above all, book time. Physically, like book it on your calendar to have that conversation. Do whatever it takes to find the mental space to have it. Lastly, there's shame, keeping us from talking about it. So it's time for some art truth. If you use this phrase, it's $5. You have to give me $5. That's the rules. No. If you are struggling with your own experiences in your head, you are not going to go psycho. You are not less than human. You are not incapable of functioning. You are not worth less than other people. You are not less intelligent. You are not dangerous. And you are not broken. And you are still capable of having human relationships. You are still capable of making decisions about your own life. You are still capable of participating in every part of that life. And you are still capable of logical, rational thought, regardless of whatever diagnosis has been applied to you. It is okay to not be okay. You have nothing to be ashamed of. We don't hear that enough. And so hopefully I want you to carry that with you. In those moments when you're fighting shame, you can also seek support from those you already trust, friends you already have at work, people who you know have your back. Because those people will also tell you that you don't have anything to be ashamed of. That you shouldn't be ashamed of you. But I know that during the course of this talk, there's been a little voice in the back of your head saying, what if this? What if that? What if these other things? So let's try and address some of those. What if nobody trusts you anymore? Well, honestly, being honest and vulnerable improves trust. This is a thing that we've seen in studies over and over again. Sharing with somebody genuinely and honestly often makes them trust you more because they know that you're going to come to them if there is a problem. But in the case that it doesn't, if somebody turns around and says, I can't trust you because you have this weird mental thing and I don't know if anything is real with you, and just have the conversation with them. I feel like you no longer trust me. I feel like you don't believe me anymore. And what can I do to regain that trust? That's a conversation you can have. It's not going to be an easy one, but it's one that you can have to attempt to regain that trust. What if everybody treats you like you're fragile? Well, I've Actually, the first time I gave a talk about mental health, I had somebody come up after and talk to me about his wife who didn't believe that mental illness was a thing, and his boss who also didn't believe that mental illness was a thing. And after I got over, like, oh my God, he actually talked about the fact that he'd been passed over for a promotion multiple times. And when he went to talk to them about it, they was like, well, we're afraid and we don't want to like stress you out. It's like, what do you think passing me over for a promotion multiple times did? You can get around this by actually showing people what your boundaries are, what's stressful to you. Part of the concern is that people who are, what I call chronically normal don't understand what your boundaries are and what's safe for you and what's not. So you can show them, help them understand, and set up a communication plan to tell them when it gets to be too much. If they are convinced that you will raise the red flag when it gets to be too much, then they'll be much more likely to give you something that is actually mildly stressful, that helps you grow, that helps your career grow. What if they don't believe you? That's just, I'm going to break the podium. I don't know how to deal with this. I mean, this is just nonsense that at this point, somebody could believe that this is not what a thing that goes on in people's brains, that there aren't people out there that are on a daily basis battling with their own selves. And the only advice I have to you in that situation is to get out, to leave. I know that's not possible for everybody, but if you're in a situation where somebody doesn't believe the words coming out of your mouth, then it's a toxic situation in an immense number of ways. And if you can't leave, I advise you to find as many allies as you can and get ready for a fight. Because it's not going to be easy. Or, again, get out as soon as you can. What if you get bullied? What if you get fired? Well, again, you kind of have to use your best judgment here. Only you are going to know if this is safe, because only you know all of your coworkers. I don't even know all of you. In general, in these cases, you are relying on your company's HR department to be in your corner. And unfortunately, your company's HR department is not your friend. They are there for the company, not for you. They are there to protect the company, not to protect you. It sucks ass, but that's how it is. And so you need to be careful because they're not going to back you up. One thing that I recommend doing is turning around and trying a trial balloon. Reveal something small, relatively safe, to somebody that you think you can trust, and then see what happens. If you hear that back in 2 weeks on the grapevine, magnified and adapted by the telephone game, then you're probably not in a safe enough space to actually have those conversations. Or certainly not with that person. This is the easiest way that I can come up with to try actually broaching these conversations. And I mean, you can start small with things like, God, I just didn't sleep well last night. Or, moderate things like, I had this weird problem. It was a whole saga I had on Twitter about getting a new dryer installed. It took like months. Things like that you can tell your coworkers and see what happens. See how they treat you. See how they take that information and whether they make it part of their, regime for mocking you or not. Okay, so let's talk about some stuff that you could do tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but Monday, unless you're working on Saturday, in which case I'm sorry. Ask yourself, is there anything going on right now that's big, or anything that's likely to happen in your near future that is also big? Remember, the stuff that we've been talking about isn't just about having a diagnosis. Experiential language opens the door to having conversations about any number of things that are emotional, that are affective, whether that's the death of a parent, something medical in your family, something happening with one of your children, something happening with one of your cats. Anything. Anything that affects you as a human is something, lose your favorite team losing whatever sports ball tournament is happening. I don't even know. Pick a thing. Like, that is still something that you could be like, I'm kind of down because my favorite team lost. That's still legitimate. Even being somebody that doesn't like sports, I know that's legitimate. You can set up plans for if and when something happens. Work around that facile optimism and that fear by putting plans down on paper and visualize yourself doing them. Start listening closely enough to your team to see if it's safe to share. If they're pulling information and you're hearing things behind people's back that is about, their emotional state, you're probably not in a very safe environment. You can also bring up the idea of sharing feelings with your team, talking about how you feel at work, and see if they treat it with complete derision or if they kind of go, well, that sounds weird and awkward. And then you can be like, well, this one guy, from a conference told me it was cool. All right, start pulling it home. Your thoughts and your emotions affect your work. How you think and how you feel affects how productive you are able to be as an employee, how awesome you are able to be as a human. Being able to discuss your experience with coworkers is important to your team's resilience. It makes you able to bounce back from things, makes you able to weather the storms of human existence. You can enable those discussions by using experiential language, by being descriptive and not prescriptive, by being compassionate, and by recognizing that just because you know what it is like for one person in the world to exist does not mean you know what it's like for everyone. You can avoid the problems of facile optimism by developing plans beforehand. And you are stronger than your fear. I want you to go out there and own your experience. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You don't need to go through the world carrying the weight of existence alone. Thank you very much for listening. We have like 3 minutes left for questions. If anybody has a question or if you want to talk, I know this is a little personal talk, so you can find me up here or out in the hallway afterward. You can also find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle has been up on every slide. My DMs are open. I'm always open to listen for whatever you have questions about. If you want the slides from this talk, they're up there, or they'll be going out on my Twitter in a little bit. Again, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Arthur. Do we have any questions on that, folks? Or do we have the silence of complete enlightenment? All right, we're going to take a short break. I'm going to get plugged in and set up, and I'm going to be up here in 15 minutes showing you all how to build a ray tracer in JavaScript in 45 minutes, because I thought this was a 1-hour talk. This will be fun.